as my colleagues referred to it, that reigns in Iran. In other words, a system of systemic, institutionalized segregation of women. The obligation to wear the veil in public is only the visible part of the discrimination that is experienced in Iran. Since the establishment of the Islamic theocracy in Iran in 1979, women legally are only worth half as much as men. The woman inherits half of what the man does. In terms of legal testimony, it takes 2 women to equal the testimony of 1 man, even in the case of premeditated murder. If a man murders his daughter, he will not be punished because she belongs to him. The mother cannot apply for legal documents, for example, a passport for her children, because her signature has no legal value. Women do not have the right to be judges, so the winner of the Human Rights Award lost her position. Many sports are forbidden to women. A woman cannot study, work, or travel without her husband's permission. Polygamy is permitted for men. A man may divorce his wife at any time without condition, even if their wife is not aware of this. And the wife must convince the judge with valid reasons in order to obtain a divorce. But this partial right was only won after many, many years of struggle. After a divorce, custody of the children is entrusted to the father or other male family member unless the child is disabled. So these are only a few examples. Iranian women are resisting, and despite systemic discrimination, 60% of those in university are girls, and much to the chagrin of the authorities, women are taking up more and more of the country's social and economic space. Now, I've talked about women's rights, but human rights in general are flouted, and repression is brutal. There is no freedom of expression. The right of association does not exist. The media are censored. Access to the internet is controlled. Any protest is violently quelled. You've heard more about it since the assassination of Mahsa Amini and the Women and Freedom Uprising. In 4 months of protests, they have killed over 600 people in the streets, including around over 50 children. They've arrested tens of thousands of people. According to the Iranian government, 22,000 have been given amnesty. But that's according to the Iranian government. Many have been sentenced to death, and actually many of you took part, and we are very grateful for this, in the sponsorship campaign of the political prisoners in order to protect them from certain death. Over the past 2 years, the government has tried to disfigure the protest movement, and they have specifically targeted people's eyes in the streets. More than 500 people have lost their sight. Today, Iran is under electronic surveillance. More than 1 million women who continue to resist the regime's dictates and appear in public without the veil have received infraction notices by text message. They've had their cars confiscated. They've been given fines. They've been sent to prison, and they still carry on. Every year, the UN Special Rapporteur denounces the violation of rights in Iran. The prisons are full of prisoners of conscience. Amnesty International regularly denounces the use of torture, rape, electric shocks, mock executions, forced confessions, and arbitrary executions in Iran. In recent years, chemical torture has been added to the physical and mental torture. And strangely enough, several suicides have been recorded upon leaving from prison. So there were prisoners who left prison and then committed suicide. These same chemical weapons were used during the Women Life Freedom movement to terrorize girls' schools, and thousands of pupils were poisoned and hospitalized between January and April 2023. We're talking about minors. The Canadian Parliament has already recognized the massacres of political prisoners in the 80s as a crime against humanity. That was in 2013 when some 9,000 prisoners were executed and then thrown into mass graves. I'm talking about Ramadan. These 44 years of Islamic rule have been accompanied by 44 years of resistance. The people have tried everything: confrontation, reform, civil disobedience. Because you see, Iranian society is young, energetic, and now above all determined to put an end to this regime of terror. But we are up against a monster. I hope I will have an opportunity to answer questions so that I can speak further.
Response to your questions. We now go to Dr. Ismailian and Mr. Dushanas. You have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. 50 days before the downing of Flight PS752, more than 1,500 peaceful Iranian protesters were brutally murdered over a few days when the regime cut off the internet and unleashed its vicious armed forces upon people on the streets in what became known as the Bloody November Massacre. The Bruman Foundation reports that over the past 45 years, more than 540 cases of assassinations and bombings have been carried out around the world by the Islamic regime through the IRGC. Over the past decades, this nefarious organization has become a source of terror for Iranians and much of the world. When we speak of the IRGC, we are referring to a vast nefarious military organization that has a stranglehold on all of Iran's resources, from mines to airports, from the film industry to sports, trading ports, factories, the bazaar, currency trade, to even a monopoly on provincial governorship posts. A monstrous entity that has no mercy on teachers, workers, artists, and ordinary citizens, persecuting, imprisoning, torturing, raping, and murdering with impunity to disrupt civil society and destroy any efforts by the people to organize peaceful resistance. The beautiful young Iranian woman, Mahsa Jina Amini's murder opened a new chapter in the book of crimes against humanity by the Islamic regime. During the Women Life Freedom Revolution in 2022, when tens of thousands took the streets in Iran and around the world, the United Nations Fact-Finding Committee reported at least 551 killings by IRGC forces. Many of the victims were children and youth who were horrifically murdered around the country. Baluchistan, Kurdistan, Mazandaran, and Tehran have suffered the highest casualties during the recent uprising. In only one day, at least 104 citizens were murdered by the IRGC in Baluchistan. Over 130 citizens were blinded by shots to the face. Tumaj Salehi, the famous Iranian rapper, and many other young Iranian protesters are currently under threat of execution. Many activists are in prison around the country. So far, many young protesters have been executed, while thousands have been arrested and suffer under extreme prison conditions. Only in the last year, the Islamic regime has executed 798 citizens without any accountability towards the people of Iran or the international community. All of these atrocities emanate from the top echelons of power in the Islamic regime that is concentrated in the IRGC. This nefarious organization is not only a menace to Iranian society on all levels, but a threat to the security of the entire Middle East and the world. Calling the IRGC what it truly is and officially declaring it as a terrorist organization is an urgent, necessary action that must be taken without delay in Canada and the rest of the free world. The families of Flight PS752 Victims Association stand with all the survivors of the victims of this brutal organization in making this demand. So I pass to Mr. Dushanas now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ismailian. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, on January 8, 2020, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard launched missile attacks against Ukrainian flight PS752 shortly after takeoff from the Tehran International Airport. 177 innocent passengers and the crew, including the unborn child, many of whom were destined for Canada, lost their lives in the terrifying attack in southwestern Tehran. The missiles attacked against the flight PS-752 were not the first nor the last of heinous crimes committed by IRGC against Iranian Canadians. A few years earlier, Iranian-Canadian photojournalist Zahra Kazemi and environmentalist Qawus Sayed Emami were murdered by the Islamic regime and the IRGC. The families of the PS-752 victims have suffered persecution, threats, and inhumane treatment by the Islamic regime over the last 5 years. The UN Human Rights Watch has reported escalation in torture and mistreatment of families of victims in Iran. Last October, Mrs. Zarabi, who lost 4 of her loved ones in the dawning of flight PS-752, attended the funeral of a young woman named Armita Gravan, who was murdered by the regime. Mrs. Zarabi was arrested and severely assaulted before being dragged on the ground to custody. A mourning mother of another victim was brutally beaten by IRGC forces at her child's grave site. Some PS-752 families have been banned from leaving Iran to attend the anniversary ceremonies of flight PS-752 victims in Toronto. There are many instances of prosecution, threats, and arrest, even some kidnapping during the anniversary ceremonies that families hold in Iran under the severe security conditions. In the aftermath of the dawning of flight PS-752, the victim's family and activists believe that there has been much ambiguity in the Canadian government's position towards IRGC. On the 4th anniversary of the dawning of flight PS-752, we heard from our Prime Minister that he will take the necessary measures in this regard. 7 months remain until the 5th anniversary of the dawning, and we all know that the association expects a clear and swift response to our demand. We believe that since Canada has suffered most from the actions of IRGC outside of Iran, it must be the first country to officially put the IRGC on the list of terrorist organizations. We hope that this will happen without any further delay. Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duchenas. So now we start with the questions from the members. No, my apologies. Yes, we have one more witness. Dr. Ziai is joining us virtually. My apologies for that. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you, Dr. Ziai.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que...
Members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran and the current situation. There is a mic on in the room. The interpreter must interrupt interpretation.
En Iran. À travers mes recherches,
through my research into the ideological political system of the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is clear that the regime's legitimacy is being significantly eroded. This is illustrated by recurrent protest movements, systematic contestation, and increasing absenteeism at elections. For example, the legislative elections held on March 1st, 2024 saw a turnout of just 41%, the lowest since the establishment of the Islamic Republic in 1979. Or the euphoric reaction to the announcement of President Raisi's death, which is indicative of the state of mind of a significant proportion of the Iranian population. A sense of relief and joy highlighted the deep-seated opposition and accumulated exasperation with the regime perceived as oppressive, authoritarian, and illegitimate. This lack of political legitimacy profoundly weakens the authority of any regime, even a non-democratic one, and it forms an essential basis for assessing its stability and acceptability to the people, in this case, the Iranian people. Iran is currently governed by a political system considered by part of its population as anachronistic. The Islamic Republic of Iran presents itself as a theocracy, while the country's women and young people aspire to a clear separation between the religious and political spheres. Even non-democratic regimes have to rely on a legitimate and legal basis to maintain their power. But how is this regime legitimate in the eyes of the Iranian people? And we have heard several testimonies to that effect today. The actions, practices, and deeds of the Islamic Republic of Iran are profoundly illegitimate and illegal under both international law and international conventions, not to mention the many human rights abuses it perpetrates. Numerous examples of these abuses have been brought here by committed collectives such as the Iranian Justice Collective and corroborated by our friends Nazanin Afshinjan and Mr. Degan, and they are also corroborated by the many testimonies of others who are present. Since its creation in 1979, the CGRI, or rather the IRGC, has seen its power grow significantly. Originally, it was a military organization founded to protect the revolutionary values of 1979. Its independence from the traditional Iranian army has enabled it to become an influential and formidable armed force. The IRGC is not just a military force. It is also deeply involved in Iran's economy, politics, and Iranian intelligence services. This reinforcement of its means of action and influence make it a key player in the Iranian political landscape. The IRGC has become a real power within Iran. It controls key sectors of the economy, notably the oil and gas industries, and it owns numerous companies through front companies. It also plays a central role in suppressing internal dissent and projecting Iranian influence abroad, supporting various non-state groups in the region. Today, the Iranian people are courageously fighting against the forced Islamization of society, an ideology which, despite the efforts of the IRGC, has partly failed. The struggle, Women, Life, Freedom, is a poignant illustration of this. This struggle for freedom and human rights is not only vital for Iran, but also has repercussions for the whole region and the world. The Islamization by force is a terror that weighs heavily, threatening peace and stability, not only in Iran and the Middle East, but also in Europe and the rest of the world, as witnessed by the repeated attacks and hostage-taking of Western nationals. In conclusion, it is imperative to actively support the Iranian people in their fight against this oppressive ideology. The future also depends on your political and institutional capacity to highlight the illegitimacy and illegality of the Iranian regime before all international and national bodies. Your role as defenders of democratic and humanitarian values can considerably strengthen the ability of Iranian men and women to overcome this state repression and establish a political system that respects human rights and fundamental freedoms. The international community must stand resolutely by those fighting for a free and democratic Iran, vigorously condemning human rights violations and applying targeted sanctions against the perpetrators. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the members for their questions. I should say it's more in the nature of rapid-fire questions, given some of the time constraints we have. So for the first round, each member will be provided 3 minutes, and we start off with MP Hoback.
It's going to have to be very quick here. Ms. Hanai, I'm just kind of curious, one of the things that we've seen is these bad actors are showing up here in Canada. What can we do to actually deal with these bad actors when they're on Canadian soil? Well, how do we identify them? How do we work with the community to identify them? And then should they just be deported, or should they actually face trial here in Canada when they are intimidating Iranian citizens and diaspora here in Canada? Did we lose her? Ms. Hanai?
Dr. Ziai?
Oui, merci pour merci.
Yes, thank you for the question. I believe Ms. Nazanin Afsinjam spoke quite eloquently about this and about the importance of things like data with photos and names. And I think the Government of Canada also has means to identify those individuals who are on Canadian territory. And it's made easier with digital technology. And the fact that people are coming to this area means they can be identified. Obviously, that requires a cooperation because there are many people collecting this kind of data. I think this work has to be done in common and shared, and by the kind of work that Ms. Nazanin Afshinjam pointed out during her testimony. That work has to be done on a regular basis in the short, medium, and long term. So that is something that is extremely important. So it has to be done over time. And I think that the Iranian diaspora can be an ally for the Government of Canada.
I want to make sure that there's a system in place so if somebody's facing threats and intimidation, either here in Canada or their family members back in Iran, that gets identified and there's actually a mechanism to deal with that. I'm running out of time here, so I guess, I'm sitting here trying to figure out why this IRGC isn't a terrorist organization. I cannot see why this hasn't happened yet. Can anybody give me some insight into what's holding things up? Like, this is crazy. Nina?
Alors, nous
Well, we don't understand either. My colleague gave reasons earlier. The government says that if it puts the IRGC on the terrorist list, then perhaps they might end up overreaching in terms of their punishments. So there are people that will be unfairly sanctioned. However, there are already sanctions against Iran. Transactions are restricted, for example. And people from the IRGC come with a lot of money. They can get through. However, there are those also who can be there are others who can be stopped with less means. For example, an artist or another individual. So we have to use the right means to get the right people.
Thank you. Yes, you're well over the 3 minutes. We now go to MP Oliphant. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses in both panels. It's always helpful. I'm going to turn to the families of the PS 752 group. Just to give you notice that I may be asking our committee to bring you back because I think your work is critical to Canada's commitment in the world. So I'd hoped you to be in more of our accountability session, but I do want to give you a chance to say a few more things. I want to talk particularly about the experience of foreign influence on family members, survivors, as well as activists in Canada who may have spoken out against the regime in Canada. And it could be either Hamid or I never use your last names, Hamid or Koresh, to speak to that. Thank you. You have the rest of my time to talk about this.
Okay. So if I may, as I testified in the Foreign Interference Commission a few months ago, I think we need to believe in the extent of foreign interference of the Islamic regime in Canada. This is the first step that we have to take. I gave an example there. So we have a former banker of Islamic regime, Mahmoud Reza Khavari in Canada. We had the former chief of police, Murtaza Talai in Canada. We had the former Minister of Health, Qazizadeh Hashemi in Canada last summer, who intimidated and who threatened the families of PS752. He said, when I go back, their actions would be retaliated. So we had the current Speaker of the House of the regime, the man who got nominated for presidency today in Iran. His son applied to come to Canada a few months ago, and he started a lawsuit against the Canadian government that why you are not fast enough to accept me as an immigrant here in this country. So, as I said, the former banker, the former chief of police, the former minister, the Speaker of the House And who's next? I'm not getting surprised if I see the Supreme Leader of Iran walking in the streets of Toronto anymore. This can happen any day. And when we are talking about hundreds of them, this is just a peak of the iceberg. I think none of you would be comfortable if you know, for example, the son of the current Speaker of the House is your neighbor in Canada. And the chief of the police was working out in a gym 2 kilometers from my house. 3 kilometers from where my wife and my daughter are buried because of PS 752. Do you feel safe in this condition? I don't think so. So I want to talk about money laundering as well. So if you go to a lot of currency exchanges stores that we have north of Toronto, and if you supervise them, you will see the amount of money that comes to Canada for money laundering from IRGC. And that's why we don't feel safe in this country. Thank you.
Yes, that is time, Mr. Oliphant, I'm afraid. So now we go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is for Ms. Ziahi. You spoke about the enthusiasm after the accidental death of the president in the helicopter that happened on the 19th of May last. So there will be elections on the 28th of June. But you also referred to the low turnout in elections. So what is your forecast of might happen? There could be a contradiction between this enthusiasm over the death of the president and the turnout of the election. So what do you expect to see on June 28th? Well, there could be a fair amount of absenteeism. They may not want to necessarily turn out, even though they are not happy with the Iranian regime. Now, there might be other kinds of demonstrations as well. There might be other types of protests at the time of the elections. The main issue over the following weeks, months, and years will be that of succession over the leader. And so it's possible that the president's position really was a launching pad for the replacement of, eventually, of the Ayatollah. So we don't know what will happen, but it is the supreme leader that has full power over all arms of the government. He is at the summit of institutional power in Iran. Do I have any time left, Chair?
Alors, j'aimerais revenir.
Then I'd like to come back quickly to the elections. So you said what might happen on the 28th. But what could happen after the 28th? For example, could there be some sort of revolution, or could it just be a confirmation of the continuity of power in place? Well, as we've seen during presidential elections, there isn't really true change that occurs. They are a clan. They're a very closed political group. So there are some distinctions made between reformists and conservatives, for example. However, nobody challenges the system. No one is challenging the Islamic Republic. And that's why they're losing their legitimacy, and that's why the Iranian population want a definitive change. They don't want to just move from one conservative leader to another conservative leader.
We next go to MP McPherson. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. It is so horrific to hear the gender apartheid, the instances we're seeing, the repression, the pain that you must feel. Sir, to have your wife and child be so close to somebody who was responsible for their deaths is appalling, absolutely appalling. I apologize that has happened to you. You know, this study is meant to look at why the IRGC is not being listed as a terrorist entity. What is the reasons that the government has given? Obviously, we've heard from the member from the Conservatives. He doesn't understand. We don't understand. Dr. Mashouf, you've told us that you don't understand why this hasn't happened. Can you take some time to tell us what it would mean to the Iranian community in Canada if the IRGC was listed as a terrorist entity? What would that mean for you and for people across this country?
Merci pour la question.
Well, thank you for the question. It would mean more security. My colleagues have already said that the goal of the IRGC is to maintain the Islamic revolution and export it elsewhere. And my colleagues have spoken to this. There have been many attacks against opponents. There are about 540 over the past 40 years. So these are assassinations outside Iran by the Iranian government through their arm. Now, fortunately, some of these assassinations have failed, but there are many threats. I asked people for examples of threats, people who've come here. You know, who has been threatened? Because you hear about people being threatened and not feeling safe. And I did receive messages from students in Toronto, for example. They said that several of them have received threatening calls. For example, that they have their photographs and their addresses. And they have also said that they'll threaten their families and call in their families if they participate in protests. So, you know, when they can't find the person in question, then they go for the families. They've also said, forget being able to return to the country. But if you do decide to return to the country, we'll be happy to have you here. So these are these kinds of threats that they're receiving. And there are others. In Montreal, there was another threat against a teacher at McGill, a professor at McGill, who was pleased that the Iranian government was going to eliminate opponents. But so there were other forms of threats. There are Iranian diplomats who have been arrested in Belgium and who have been sentenced to 20 years in prison. But in one particular case, they were exchanged between governments, between the Iranian and the Belgian government. So people feel threatened. Everyone feels threatened.
Thank you. For the next question, we go to MP Chattel. MP Chattel, you have 2 minutes.
Merci. Thank you very much, Chair. And I'd like to put my question to Ms. Ziai. After the death of Mahsa Amini, the population rose up, and there was hope that human rights might change. What do you think Canada and the international community could do? What kind of measures could they adopt to support human rights, but also to support democratic movements within the country? Earlier, you referred to targeted sanctions, to strengthening the ability of Iranians to have their rights defended and supported. So perhaps more concretely, what would you suggest? I think the interpreter apologized, but the sound quality is deteriorating. The service will have to be interrupted because the sound quality does not allow for interpretation.
Intellectuels, des journalistes qui sont dans les prisons iraniennes. Ces gens-là ne devraient pas être en prison. On ne devrait pas avoir ce type de profil dans les prisons. C'est devenu une maison culturelle. La prison d'Evin est devenue une maison culturelle. Vous n'avez pas des criminels à l'intérieur.
Dr. Ziai, I sincerely apologize for interrupting. There wasn't much time left anyways, but the interpretation was on and off. So if you could graciously provide a response to MP Chatel's question in writing and submit it to us, we would be very, very grateful indeed. Sorry about that, but the translation has been experiencing some problems. So we now go to Mr. Abel-Taif. You have 2 minutes.
The question to Mr. Ismailian, you mentioned the money laundering situation. It's, I'm sure we're probably aware of many of aspects of it's happening. In which areas you believe that the regime, the IRGC, is performing the type of money laundering in Canada, and how severe that if you have any assessment to give us, that would be good for the report. Thank you.
So I think the majority of this money goes to real estate in Canada, especially in big cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. And, you know, it's like, you know, among Iranians, when there's somebody involved in corruption, usually they say, okay, we will find him in Vancouver next month. This is something that, this is a saying among Iranians inside the country. But let me give you an example. A friend of mine, like 2 or 3 years ago, he decided to bring all his savings from Iran. And he wanted to declare that to CRA. So when he asked the currency exchange store that, okay, how should I declare that to the CRA? So the answer was, what's the point? I bring millions of dollars every day, and there's no consequences, and there's no investigation or supervision. So I think it would be the good answer for your question.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. I apologize, but you only have a minute, so it should be a very rapid question.
Question express.
Quick question then for Professor Ziai. Iran is presiding or presided over Human Rights Council in 2023, despite its terrible record. Canada announced its intention to be a candidate in 2030. Do you think this is relevant given the quality or the credibility of the Council, given Iran's participation?
En tout cas, que de la part de la population.
Well, I'll say on behalf of the Iranians, this choice was criticized. We didn't expect this to happen. I mean, it's the height of a paradox for this kind of country to be at the head of that committee. So what is going to happen? What will be on the table? Are they going to approve the fact that artists and journalists are being tortured psychologically, etc.? I mean, all the types of torture was referred to. What are they going to talk about? Are they going to talk about these cases? I'd like to know. What's going to be on the table? What's going to be discussed and negotiated when you have that sort of country being chairing this committee?
And now we go for the final question to MP McPherson. Again, my apologies. You only get 1 minute.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ismailian, you know that many people that died in PS 752, we had many from Edmonton, Strathcona. So I'll put the same question to you that I did just ask Dr. Mahjoub. What would be the impacts on the families if the IRGC was listed as a terrorist organization?
2 weeks ago in Iran, okay, my parents, my father is 75, my mom is 74, so now they are banned to leave the country and travel to Canada. It happens like 6 months ago when they decided to come to the 4th anniversary. 2 weeks ago in Iran, They went to their house, 3 plainclothes officers, and they summoned them to go to intelligence service. So my father had to answer the questions related to my activities here. So this is just one example of hundreds of families. And as others, my colleagues said today, we don't really understand why the IRGC is not on the list, because I think the impact is great on the families. I mean, then we see that our government is doing something. And sometimes we hear that they're worried about safety of Canadians, but they already killed Canadians. They already did.
Thank you very much. That concludes all the questions. I wanted to take this opportunity to speak on behalf of all the members. We're very, very grateful for your attendance here today.